Hello, hello.
Hey, welcome to episode 5 of the series of the discussions I have with Stephen,
Hello,
my
hello.
son. And
Yes.
these have been great so far. Been really enjoying these things with you. Um, Today we are going to talk about atheism and abiogenesis and um, how we can understand, the ideas of atheism. But first, a little introduction. So, first of all, why am I qualified to discuss abiogenesis? I mean, you know, uh, first of all, I don't have a degree in biology or chemistry or microbiology or anything,
Nor to
um,
me.
nor you. Sometimes it takes somebody to look out from outside the box to understand these things. If you look at Elon Musk, he didn't graduate with a degree in rocket science, but yet he started SpaceX, which is a rocket company. So, you know, we have the ability to look at these things from a different perspective than what our schools and universities train us to look at. And I have done that. I've spent the last 20 years trying to understand um, abiogenesis and the science behind it. I've read at least 15 university level textbooks on the subject, well, on biology, microbiology, chemistry, thermodynamics. I've taken classes, biology classes online from Harvard and from MIT. And I know a lot about the subject. It's something that I've just enjoyed learning about, and it's something that it's kind of been a very passionate hobby for the last 20 years for me. And
And
so,
you've learned a lot, that's for sure. You've learned a lot.
yes,
And these discussions are something that we are able to, focus in on those learnings and those teachings that you've experienced in the different various formats that are presented to you, and you're able to piece them together and say, no, this doesn't make a lot of sense, or though this does make a lot of sense, but this disproves that.
so any rejection of what I present based on my own personal uh, qualifications is just ad hominem. I mean, that's what you would be doing is if you rejected it based on just the fact that, well, I don't have a degree. But I've literally read hundreds of peer reviewed papers on the subject, and I understand them. I know what's going on. I understand the subject. I'm also a member of Mensa. Mensa is a high IQ society. So I'm a pretty smart guy, right?
Yes.
Um, so been doing uh, been doing this for a short time, and so Stephen, tell us about yourself. Tell us what you're up to. And hey, I watched your latest Twitch stream.
Mm-hmm.
You're streaming Age of Wonders 4, which is an awesome game. I have to pull a plug there for the game because it's
It is a
it is
very
such
good
a fun
game.
game.
So I am Stephen Robert's son, and I have uh, a little bit of college under my belt, so I'm not quite as learned as my father is. I've only been, doing various studies where I can, but I'm mostly interested in ancient history and languages as well, and their etymologies and how they were formed, and kind of the similarities that they get through there. So that's where I take my studies on occasion, though I'm very busy trying to just keep myself alive and and exist through my job, which is doing support specialist work for software testing, so for Microsoft. And um, on my off time, when I'm still wanting to have fun, I'm just playing video games and having fun with the community over at Vox Draconis. You can find me at twitch.tv/Amendelweir. I have feel good streams where I just try to have an uplifting environment, give people positive feedback on their lives, and show that the light is not far from them and that they can have better things. I also have my own merchandise and you have a Vox Draconis, which is a Discord community that you can come and join to just exist and find happier things together. We love fantasy. We love all sorts of dragon-oriented media, and even just things that make us feel good. We're good to have together and be together. So it's not all just super spiritual talk. We can have fun too.
And it's enjoyable watching you. I've watched your streams, and it's a lot of fun. Also, I'm sporting a new look here. I've got some facial hair, which is very unusual for me. This might be either the first time you see it, and it might be also the last time you see it on me.
You look better without it.
I've been told that I look more professorial, more like a professor. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. Nah. But so anyway, let's jump right into the topic tonight. This is so. First of all, what is atheism? Atheism, basically, they say, "Well, I don't believe in God, right? I choose not to believe in a God." The beginning of the word "a," and then actually the other way. So atheist is not. A means not. Theist means God belief or belief in God. So an atheist does not believe in God. Mm-hmm. Well, if they don't believe in God, if they don't believe in a creator, you exist, right? I think you exist. I know I exist. I know I exist because I think, therefore I am, right? We went over that last week. So atheism basically says there's no creator that the creators. Do you exist?
Yes, I very much would hope so. This is not a dream.
Okay, so
pinch.
I know I exist, but I have to take your word that you exist. I believe you. I believe that you exist. So really, the only thing I know is that I exist. So how do I exist? Well, you were created by us as your parents, your mom and I. Mm-hmm. I was created by my mom and dad, and they were created by their parents, and back further and further until we get to the ancestors of whatever created humans to to mammals to as we go through the tree down to the earliest form of life. And so the earliest form of life had to have been created. Now, atheists, there's only two options here. There's only two options for life.
Yeah.
The first option is supernatural, which atheists reject. I mean, if you look at a supernatural creation, you have to be, by definition, a theist to believe in a supernatural creation.
Yeah.
Atheists reject a supernatural creation. Therefore, the only option left available to them is a natural origin of life. That somehow we were spontaneously or accidentally created. And that natural origin of life is called abiogenesis. And when we look at so let's read this here. So when I was first studying, so abiogenesis means not, right? Bio means life, mm-hmm. and genesis means generated. So it's abiogenesis means that it was started or generated by non-life. Chemicals formed into other chemicals that started replicating, that started to add on more chemicals and molecules, and finally we have something
becomes life
that is able to self-metabolize and become life. Yes.
Not life becomes life.
Not life becomes life.
Okay.
So when I first started studying this, now this kind of dates me because I was watching Cosmos. Not the new Cosmos. This is the old Cosmos with Carl Sagan.
I have not seen this. This is before my time.
This is a long time ago. But this is what he said. And I was surprised by this. So read his quote.
All right. The products of this early chemistry dissolved in the oceans, forming a kind of organic soup of gradually increasing complexity until one day, quite by accident, okay, a molecule arose which was able to make crude copies of itself, using as building blocks the other molecules in the soup. This was the ancestor of DNA, the master molecule of life on Earth. So Carl Sagan said this?
Carl Sagan said this. This is a direct quote from the video, number 2. And this is what I like to call the accident of the gaps. So critics, critics of theism or atheists, they like to claim, well, you believe in the God of the gaps, right? God did it. But the problem is that there's still all these unknowns, and all they're appealing to is the accident of the gaps.
Yep.
Carl Sagan used this word, accident. It was an accident. And to say these things, it's just the accident of the gaps.
They're just saying that it's not meant to be. We were never supposed to be, and that atheism is no creation as we know it in reality isn't real.
Right.
Because it's an accident.
It's just an accident.
It completely removes
you
themselves
we're just
from the
accidents.
equation. All the gaps that they're talking about, they're just enforcing, by what I'm reading here, that it doesn't matter. There is no morality.
Well, when we get into the moral issue, that's a little different. We can discuss that. We're actually, next week, we're going to talk about the idea of, is God good? Because this is what it leads to, is if we are nothing more than an accident, we are just stardust, then there can't be any morality.
How that's what I'm getting at. If it's just an accident, there is no morality.
Exactly.
Well, okay, I'm getting ahead of ourselves again, but it makes sense.
So this is it's kind of intuitive. Now, if you think about it, if we were to take a skyscraper, and we wanted to create a skyscraper, and we took it and we put it on the most energetic part of the earth, and what we did is we took all of the steel and the support beams and the glass and the all the concrete and the foundation, everything, and we put that on the most earthquake-prone spot on the entire earth.
Oh boy.
Okay.
There's plenty of places. Let's just put it on the fault in California, just for example.
Put it on the San Andreas Fault, and let's just speed up time, and let's just say we have earthquakes that happen constantly, and that we can, how long can we wait until an earthquake will create a skyscraper?
Create a skyscraper.
Yeah.
So there's no skyscraper there.
There's no skyscraper there.
We have the materials for a skyscraper.
We have the materials for a skyscraper. We put all the materials on one spot. How long can we wait for a skyscraper to form?
We're waiting. I don't think it'll happen. It's not everything that shakes down is not going to shake up. So
now, okay, notwithstanding the number of floors, right? They say, well, you give it enough time and enough tries. It's not. We look at probabilities and say, is it improbable that a skyscraper is going to form, or is it impossible for a skyscraper to form? Now,
at what point does improbable become impossible?
Exactly. Because we intuitively know, we just know that you cannot build a skyscraper on an earthquake spot, because The first, let's give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's just say, hey, it formed the first 3 floors, maybe even the first 4 floors, maybe 5. We got 5 floors. Okay. What's the most likely thing to happen the next time there's an earthquake? Yeah. Whatever's created is going to uncreate and fall down. So we intuitively know this, but we don't understand why. What's the reason why? Well, if we take a cell, now a cell is actually far more complicated than a skyscraper is. A skyscraper is nothing compared to a living cell. And this is a prokaryote. This is one of the most tiny cells available that you can get. A prokaryote is so simple. There's nothing to it. And yet this cell alone is about as complicated as a spaceship to get into space. It requires different systems. It requires repair systems. It requires manufacturing systems. It requires structural systems, information systems. It requires a computer called DNA. I mean, a cell is just so much more complicated than even a skyscraper, or anything else that man could create. And
we
so
still
let's
don't
start.
even know everything about them. We only think we know everything about them.
We don't. And so when we start looking at what a prokaryote is made of, well, it has amino acids, and we know that amino acids make proteins, right?
Yep.
Now, scientists have not even thus far been able to create they've been able to create simple amino acids. Let's give them that. That's just like creating the first 5 floors, right?
And not in very great quantities, and they are very unstable. We have to remember that these tests that they performed to make those amino acids were under strict environmental control conditions, and they were unstable. If they were moved or like put in with a different kind of beaker, they could fall apart.
Exactly. Yeah, they're basically just garbage, or they're things that were thrown in with garbage, tar and other things that just make them unusable. So when we look at amino acids, they haven't even been able to create all of the amino acids. I think they're missing 5. You know what? They may eventually create all the amino acids. That's fine. That's like creating 5 floors, right? They have lipids, so the prokaryotes are made of lipids, which are fats that create the cell membranes. Now they've been able to self-organize vesicles, which are fat layers, and been able to do that. So yeah, they've been able to get a couple of these things. Pyrimidines and pyridians. These are nucleobases. When we're looking at A, C, G, and T, which is adenosine, guanine, cytosine, uracil. So those are the nucleobases, right?
Yeah.
They haven't been able to create those. Well, they may have been able to create the pyridines, but they have not been able to create the pyrimidines. So the pyrimidines are a little more complicated. When it comes to ribose, absolutely not. No, they have not even been begun to create ribose. It's just absolutely beyond anything that scientists can do. Now,
and from a chemical state, not from a organic life making ribose for them. So we're talking about dead materials, right? Dead materials becoming ribose.
We are talking about abiogenesis here. We are talking about without life. Life can create ribose, no problem. Life creates these molecules, no problem at all. Now it takes a pyrimidine and a pyridine to connect to it takes a nucleobase to connect to ribose, which then becomes a nucleoside. And then you add on a phosphate group, and a phosphate group is a single phosphate atoms connected to two or three other oxygen atoms, and we'll get into this.
Yeah.
And so you get all that together, and then you can create RNA, DNA, and ATP. And they can't even create ribose, much less creating RNA and DNA and ATP. They are so far away from creating ATP that it's ridiculous. And the reason they can never create it is the same reason that skyscrapers don't form itself, because there's too
unstable. Too much that can happen to break it apart.
And what that's called it's called potential energy. When we look at a skyscraper, there is a tremendous amount of potential energy.
Yes.
The idea is that instead of forming something, an earthquake will bring it down. Any energy that will shake apart a skyscraper, it will bring it down. Why? Because there's a tremendous amount of potential energy in the system. And that potential energy wants to be released. It wants to come out. And so there's this principle of thermodynamics called the minimum total potential energy principle. And so why don't you go ahead and read that?
The fundamental concept used in physics and engineering. It dictates that at low temperatures, a structure or body shall deform or displace to a position that locally minimizes the total potential energy, with the lost potential energy being converted into kinetic energy, specifically heat.
So when a earthquake happens and a skyscraper comes tumbling down, that energy is then converted into kinetic energy and heat. It's going to take a lot of heat as that building comes down. Okay, so this is a concept that that you won't hear in. I don't hear any other scientists talking about this. They just don't.
Synthetic chemistry. Synthetic chemists totally know about this principle and this concept.
Oh yeah, they do. They understand it intuitively, but they don't piece together what it is. So I'm putting together the pieces here that tells us why it's intuitive, but also the laws behind it. So just as it's intuitive to that we know a skyscraper is going to come down, we know that RNA, DNA, these macromolecules, these huge molecules, the more you add them together, and like I say, they're more complicated than a skyscraper. Instead of 100 stories high, they're thousands. They're thousands of stories high. And when you add energy to these things, they're going to break apart. They're not going to be sticking themselves together. They're going to break apart because of potential energy. Each time you add on something to the chain, it adds more potential energy. Each time you build a story in a skyscraper, it adds more potential energy. That energy wants to be released.
And this plays into effect because the potential energy of materials that are synthetically created is extremely high. But we're like, well, how do our bodies get it? It's because that potential energy is continually converting into kinetic energy and refreshing itself at the same time. So you have to get a complete skyscraper so that it can resist the earthquake. You have to get an entire cell that can operate and feed itself. And minimum total potential energy principle says until you get to that point, you're going to fall over.
Exactly. Yes. A protein, that's why the proteins fold. They will actually they'll take a string and they'll fold into a three-dimensional shape. That three-dimensional shape then has actually less potential energy in that shape than it does in a string. And so as a string, it has a tremendous amount of potential energy, and anything can break it apart.
Because the molecules want to go.
Yep. So when we understand this, there's also it's why half-life occurs. When you talk about half-life, it's a principle of potential energy. So why do snowflakes form? A snowflake is actually more complicated than just regular water, right? But there is actually less potential energy in a snowflake than there is in a water molecule. It takes energy. You have to have energy from the sun. You have to have heat to melt that crystal, melt the ice, melt the snowflake, so that the snowflake will then turn into water. There is more energy in water than there is in a snowflake. There's less potential energy in a snowflake. If you take a rubber band and you stretch it, what does it want to do?
It wants to come back together. That's potential energy.
Exactly. But what happens if you hold that out and you just let it hold and you just let it stay? And what happens when you just stretch it and stretch it and stretch it and stretch it?
Oh, you're continuing to stretch it. It's going to break apart the bonds.
It's going to break apart the bonds. Eventually, that potential energy wants to be released. That potential energy wants to come back together.
And technically, it is already releasing a modicum of kinetic energy in order to come back together already, because each of the molecules will eventually start to break down.
Yes. So what we see half-life occurring in a stretched rubber band, or a spring could be the same way. If you look at a metal spring and it's sprung, right? The half-life of the spring is so far gone that it doesn't spring back and forth anymore. So the potential energy releases as kinetic energy over time. It's the reason why rocks don't fly. We intuitively know that rocks don't fly in the air. Why? Because it seeks the lowest form of potential energy. It wants to sit on the ground where there's the least amount of potential energy. If the rock was flying, if it was in the air, that has potential energy. Anything wants to come down because of gravity. It's also, in this other picture I've got up here, that's uranium. This is why uranium forms, or why uranium decays in a half-life of several million years, is because more than several billion years, it forms, it breaks apart and decays eventually into lead. Now, lead is a stable element, but uranium is constantly breaking apart. It's releasing electrons and protons, and it breaks apart, right?
Yeah.
So this is all part of the minimum total potential energy principle. Things break apart just by having potential energy. It releases slowly as kinetic energy, and it wants to come down into the lowest minimum form of potential energy.
Okay, we got that out of the way. It's very important we know that.
The reason I bring that up is because remember what I said about the idea that we haven't even made pyrimidines and the other one, the nucleobases. We have not even created the nucleobases. And the reason why, so Stanley Miller is the guy that did the Miller-Urey experiment. Mm-hmm. He was the one, he was a young guy, and he relied on his professor, Professor Urey, to help him publish the paper. And he did a lot of testing with other things later in his life. In the 90s, he was still very active in testing these molecules. He was trying to find the way to abiogenesis, and he just wasn't ever able to. And so what we have is some of his papers talking about these nucleobases. So go ahead and read this. What does Stanley Miller say about the nucleobases?
The half-lives are too short to allow for the adequate accumulation of these compounds, which he's referencing adenine, uracil, guanine, cytosine, and thiamine. Mm-hmm. We show here that the rapid rates of hydrolysis of nucleobases A, U, G, C, and T at temperatures above 0 degrees Celsius would present a major problem in the accumulation of these presumed essential compounds on the early Earth. A high temperature origin of life involving these compounds, therefore, is unlikely. These results are applicable to any origin of life theory in which life begins with the evolution of a self-replicating genetic system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution.
So we have Stanley Miller himself, who's basically refuting, falsifying the idea that abiogenesis could occur here, especially at higher temperatures or at higher energetic levels, because of half-life. So these are the half-life of nucleobases. Well, when it comes to the ribose, it's even worse. What does it say about ribose?
Because ribose is the sugar backbone of RNA and DNA, sugars are known to be unstable in strong acid or base, but there are few data for neutral solutions. Therefore, we have measured the rate of decomposition of ribose between pH 4 and pH 8 from 40 degrees Celsius to 120 degrees Celsius. The ribose half-lives are very short, 73 minutes at 7 and 100 degrees, and 44 years at 7 and 0 degrees.
At pH 7, so that's
pH 7.
pH value. pH is 7 is neutral. So
neutral.
It's
so these
acidic.
Results suggest that the backbone of the first genetic material could not have contained ribose or other sugars because of their instability. Ribose has a lot of potential.
That is a damning statement to any origin of life theory. It could not have contained ribose. So what they've done is, well, they've said, well, okay, since ribose couldn't exist, maybe it was some other sugar that helped form life. The problem is,
what other sugars? They're more complicated.
The problem is that ribose still exists. The ribose is what exists today.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to create ribose. You still need to create ribose somewhere along the chain, and then you have to replace whatever they start with. You have to replace that with ribose, and that's even worse because it's no longer favored. If it was created with something less complex, then that's what was favored. That's what would continue to work,
to be
right?
That because now what you would have is a cell utilizing that kind of sugar.
Exactly.
But we have a cell that's using ribose.
So you now have to have ribose replace what's favored.
Mm-hmm.
No, it just doesn't work that way. You just don't replace a favored molecule with something like ribose. You still have to create ribose.
Yep.
And then you have to replace the favored molecule with ribose. Chemically, it doesn't work that way. Chemically, it says...
even in synthetic chemistry, they'll tell you, what are you asking me to do?
Exactly.
You what?
Yeah.
You kidding me? They'll say, you're nuts. I'm not trying to make this for you.
So we have ribose that just absolutely destroys any chance of abiogenesis here. Now, ribose is absolutely necessary for RNA. What we have here is basically it's a GMP. It's a guanine monophosphate. Okay, guanine monophosphate. What we have is the guanine side with a ribose and a phosphate backbone. Okay, it's a phosphate ribose backbone, and you'll see the ribose is connected by 5. It's kind of like a pentagram.
Yeah.
Right. That's called a pentose. 5. Pent 5. It's a 5 connected chain. And so what we have, again, we don't have guanine. We don't have ribose. We may have some phosphate groups, but we have a problem with that, and I'll get into that. So this is how sophisticated the most simple molecules are. These are not small molecules. These are macromolecules that are just huge.
Yeah, it's
And
not oxygen.
the amount of potential energy in this. So what I want to notice is, can you see all these O's? When we see a bend
Mm-hmm.
in the molecule, that's carbon. We can put a C there. C is carbon.
A bend.
Okay.
That means carbon. Okay.
Yeah,
So
a bend without any other letter there. If there's a bend without a letter, it's carbon. If we look
like
at
up at the top with the ribose up there, it goes R and O together, and that bend is going to
the
be
R
carbon.
is the side chain.
R is
Okay,
a side
R
chain.
is the link. R is a
Mhm.
link to a side chain.
Okay.
So we have O, or the side chain is connected to the carbon. Okay, because there's a bend right there.
Yep.
Okay, and then we have another bend, and then
carbon
down
there.
below, the carbon is connected to an OH.
Yes.
And then we have over here, we have another O, and then the phosphate group, which is a phosphate atom connected to a bunch of oxygen atoms.
Yes.
And then we have, as it goes down that way,
it hits 3, 4, 5 carbons.
Carbon. Yeah. So 5 carbon. Yes. So those are all carbons.
All right.
Okay. Now, when we look at the half-life of, we've already looked at the half-life of the nucleobases. We've looked at the half-life of ribose. What's the half-life of RNA?
A new method to measure the half-life of RNA molecules has now been created by researchers. Their study revealed that commonly used methods provide distorted results and that RNA molecules live an average of only 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Which is 10 times shorter than previously assumed. The experiments were repeated for some 50 different genes and showed that 80% of all RNAs undergo a rapid turnover, living less than 2 minutes and can be classified as short-lived. Only about 20% live longer, for about 5 to 10 minutes. These results are astounding if you consider that until now it was assumed that on average RNAs survive 20 minutes in the cell. Oh boy.
So we can see, we saw that, the cytosine had like a half-life of 44 years. As you build the skyscraper, the faster it comes down. As
you hit a ceiling.
As you have more potential energy, it wants to break down. That potential energy wants to come apart. It doesn't like to be stuck together in a molecule. It wants to come apart.
It wants to well, even now we're energetic beings. We have to move. We want to move. Living requires movement and kinetic energy. In order to get more food, we have to move. So
we have an external source of food that builds these things for us. We have manufactured facilities called cells and ribosomes that will actually go and form these things to manufacture life for us.
Yes.
Without these manufacturing facilities, synthetic chemists are, they can't do it.
And they hit a timetable too. Like a synthetic compound has a timetable. You cannot get all these things put together in some sort of soup in time.
Right.
So assuming there is ends effort from natural origin, you have 2 minutes. Okay, it broke. That's another factor. Yes. Time. Well, we have all the time in the world, but you can only do it every 2 minutes.
That's the big problem. See, they say with all the time in the world and enough tries, that eventually something will build, right? Well, I'm still waiting for that skyscraper to build something on that earthquake spot,
Curiously, too, if this were also a thing, wouldn't there be more life created all the time?
That's why they assume the accident of the gaps. That's why they have to hold to the accident of the gaps. Because
these are good questions I have.
Yes. They don't know. Now, So here's another molecule. This ATP. ATP, as we see, is it's got an adenosine side chain.
Yes.
Okay. So over here on the far side over
left or right. Left or right. Just say left or right.
Yeah, on the right hand side. On the right hand side is
adenosine.
Adenosine, and it's connected to the pentose, right, which is a ribose molecule. So an adenosine triphosphate is an adenosine. It's a nucleoside with 3 phosphate groups. And the phosphate group is a phosphate molecule in the middle, surrounded by oxygen atoms. All right.
Yes. And there are hydrogen atoms attached to those.
Yeah, and
it has an extra one.
And so what we see here is ATP, and ATP has so much potential energy that it just wants to bust almost as soon as it's created. The thing is that
looking at it, that triphosphate group has 1 extra hydrogen than I am supposing is supposed to be there.
Oh, it is so chaotic. That is so. This is the catalyst that gives the energy to create bigger molecules. So ATP is what goes in it, and it attaches itself to another molecule, and it provides the energy by breaking it off into ADP. It breaks off one of the phosphate groups and converts from ATP, as adenosine triphosphate, into adenosine diphosphate.
Yeah, 2
phosphate groups. And when it breaks, it releases the kinetic energy to create these. It starts to build bigger molecules. So we have this energy source that can create bigger molecules, but by itself, it just wants to explode. It does not want it. The half-life is in seconds, and your body will produce something like 10 trillion molecules of ATP every single day. So you definitely want to have ATP working in your body. Without it, you're not going to survive.
Blech.
Now, one of the things I want to notice here is look at all these O's. You see all these O's?
Oxygen.
I showed you carbon is where there's a bend, right?
Yep.
But where there's the O's, those are oxygen.
Yes.
Now, ATP has 13. This is the molecular formula down below. It has 13 atoms of oxygen in it, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of important.
That's an odd number of oxygen.
Now, what are the 3 things? What 3 things do living things require?
On a basic level, oxygen,
O2.
Water.
Yep. Water. Yep.
And a source of energy, also known as the sun.
Source of energy known as the sun. Now, the sun gives photosynthesis to our plants, which our plants then feed the animals, and we can eat plants and we can eat other animals, and we receive food. So all of our source of energy comes from the sun, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, what 3 things want to kill life?
The sun.
Sun.
Oxygen.
And
water.
That's why we have these silica packets. Mm-hmm. They absorb water. They absorb moisture, so that moisture, when we try to preserve food, moisture and water doesn't get in the way, right?
I'm really glad for silica being put into my jerky. Yes.
So,
keeps the moisture out.
So the other packets over here they're basically iron, and iron eats up oxygen. So iron will take the oxygen out of the air and eat up the oxygen. Now that's important because oxidation. Oxygen actually kills life. Now, again, I put this in here again because I wanted to look at all of these O's in RNA. That's a lot of oxygen, right? We have the phosphate group. We have the ribose has oxygen in it.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is scientists say that life could not form in the presence of oxygen because of oxidation. Now,
So they created a double negative in their situation, right? So unless there's oxygen, they can't get ribonucleic acids. But if there's oxygen, it's just going to oxidize whatever they put in there.
exactly. Oxidation is so damning to their theories. I want you to look at this. Okay, so RNA, it has this OH on the bottom of the ribose.
Yes.
You see the OH?
Yep, the hydrogen-oxygen attachment there.
Now, that is missing from DNA. Ribonucleic acid has an extra oxygen molecule that DNA does not have. DNA stands for deoxyribose, deoxyribonucleic acid. Deoxy means minus one oxygen molecule. So deoxynucleic acid, deoxyribonucleic acids, is more stable. Why? Because it has less oxygen in it. But it still requires oxygen. Yeah. It just doesn't have that oxygen on ribose that causes RNA hydrolysis.
Okay.
Now, RNA hydrolysis is we see the chain of oxygen as it attaches itself to the phosphate group. And I know this is kind of a little hard to follow.
Yeah, but they didn't teach this to me in my college class.
they're not going to, because this shows you exactly how damning and how the word I'm looking for, how reactive oxygen is. Oxygen is so reactive that it takes that oxygen molecule in ribose, it hits the phosphate group, and it will eventually, as we follow the chain, it will split apart RNA. And it does this just spontaneously. It'll just do this,
Yeah, I'm just like following the flow right here from left to right, and then I see the extra oxygen hydrogen molecule kind of like seep in on it, and then it attacks that double oxygen slot, because O2, you want to have oxygen be together with another oxygen. It's really stable that way with their electron group. And so this energy cuts it off. It is literally split apart. You don't have RNA anymore there.
You don't. Yeah. This is how RNA split apart. And so it's called RNA hydrolysis. Hydrolysis actually means water. Water forming, or there's a water molecule that's created in the process of this, or water molecule that might be going and attack it and splitting it apart, because that's what happens with proteins. So oxygen is so damning to their theories that what did they do? They so this
I got to put on a mind explosion for that.
Yes.
Even with my level of education, I can see that that's not going to work.
Exactly. So we can see how, the natural origin of man is just
blown out of the water. Literally.
So literally. Oxidation, it can either be very fast, like what we see in fire. Fire is it's the rapid oxidation of combustion. If you remove oxygen, if you cover it and you eliminate the oxygen from the system, it burns itself out, right? Because oxidation, there's no more oxygen to get in to cause oxidation.
Yes.
So it's a very violent reaction.
Very quick.
Very quick. Rust is another form of oxidation. It takes iron. Oxidation. Iron is a reducer, and oxygen will then flow into iron and create rust. Okay. So what they did is they simply said, well, since our theories won't work, we're just going to toss oxygen out altogether. We're just going to say, there wasn't any oxygen in the air.
Okay. Well, how are you going to get that RNA?
How are you going to get the oxygen for the RNA and ATP and all phosphate groups, right?
Yes.
So what they've done is they said it was Alexander Oparin and Haldane's theory that there probably was a reducing atmosphere. They call it a reducing. Remember, iron is a reducing. It reduces the amount of oxygen in the air. So
yes.
Iron would have reduced. Water is a reducing agent. It takes oxygen from away, and it reduces oxygen. So they say that, well, all of these things were reduced into other compounds.
All right.
And the entire evidence for their theory is Stanley Miller's experiment, the Miller-Urey experiment, done in 1952, where he simply took oxygen out of his experiment. He said, since oxygen won't work, let's just remove oxygen from the experiment.
Okay.
And so he did.
All right. Without any present oxygen, an early Earth in its history had a reducing atmosphere. But if you have no oxygen, now all you have is rust, which is a terribly toxic compound. Terribly toxic. You do not have things really touching rust because it's bad. It will oxidize you. It will kill you.
So go ahead and read the reducing atmosphere there.
A reducing atmosphere is an atmospheric condition in which oxidation is prevented by removal of oxygen and other oxidizing gases or vapors, and which may contain actively reducing gases such as hydrogen, carbon monoxide, and gases like hydrogen sulfide that would be oxidized by any present oxygen. About 2.5 billion years ago, it transitioned to an oxidizing atmosphere with molecular oxygen as the primary oxidizing agent.
Okay. So what they say is that oxygen didn't exist in the early Earth, that it was all taken away. They just threw out oxygen because if there was oxygen, then life couldn't form. And so
instead we have just carbon monoxide, which kills us, just hydrogen, which is extremely burnable.
Well, it would be in water, so it would be H2O.
But then there's oxygen in the water. So,
but remember, there's. So if you take free floating oxygen away, you can't create the molecule because the molecule is created by oxygen atoms.
Yes.
So you take oxygen, but this is their. This is their
can't
evidence.
Even grasp this. I can't even grasp because I'm just like, well, but there's oxygen right here. It would it would move. I've taken chemistry. It just happens. Okay, it does it.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be told to. It just does it.
So this is their evidence that there was no oxygen in the atmosphere.
No.
I want to repeat that. This is their evidence. Stanley Miller's evidence is the only evidence they have that there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, that there was a reducing atmosphere 4.5 billion years ago.
2.5 here, 4.5.
Well, 4.5 billion years ago is when they say
let's
that
just
these all
throw in a
occurred.
number. Let's just make it lengthy.
Yeah. 2 million years just isn't enough time, so they had to go 4.5 billion. And so later, life formed, and life starts producing oxygen, which then creates an oxidizing atmosphere. So life is what created our current oxygen in our atmosphere.
All right. Okay.
The only evidence they have for this is Stanley Miller's experiment. It's basically, if you know what circular logic is, circular logic says, the Bible is true because the Bible says it's true, because the Bible says it's true, because the Bible says it's true. That's circular logic. abiogenesis is true because there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and we know there was no oxygen in the atmosphere because there is no oxygen in the atmosphere.
They're so silly. Dude, that's just silly.
All right, let's move on.
What's next?
Again, so we see, again, I put here, we see the molecular formula of RNA. If there was no oxygen, this C10H14N5O8, 8 oxygen atoms in guanine monophosphate with the P phosphate group. So 8 oxygen. If there was no oxygen, you're not going to form a molecule with oxygen in it, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Because it has no way to transfer itself.
Again, same thing with ribose. Ribose has 5 oxygen atoms. The problem with ribose is they can be matched. They can go in different layouts. That same oxygen, that same molecular formula can be in a pentose. It can be in a 6 carbon chain. It can be in a straight line where it's just a straight molecule.
And it can be reversed in that straight line.
And it can be in reverse in that straight line. So what we see here is, there's, and we'll get to this, it's called homochirality, or this is chirality. So these are stereoisomers.
I keep getting ahead of us.
That's fine.
Talk about that.
So you know what? Let's just give them the idea that, hey, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. Okay, let's just give it to them. Let's just say, okay, you're right, and somehow you figured out how to get all of the oxygen in all these molecules. The problem is ozone.
Ooh. Ozone, 3 oxygen atoms.
Ozone is pure oxygen. It's 3 oxygen atoms connected to each other.
Yep.
And ozone does what?
Well, it blocks radiation. That's what I know.
Ultraviolet rays. C. Ultraviolet rays. Now, as you can see in this picture, I know it's not very clear. It says that 100% of ultraviolet C rays are blocked by ozone. Ultraviolet C. Now, there's different levels of ultraviolet rays. Okay.
Yeah. This
ultraviolet
is the wavelength of 100 to 280 nanometers.
Yes. Ultraviolet C is an ionizing radiation, which means that it will ionize, or it will break apart atoms, break apart molecules. So anything that comes with ultraviolet C is just irradiated. It's just they're just destroyed. The photon will go in and it will break apart anything that's connected. All right, and it will just irradiate the entire Earth. So without oxygen, remember we have an oxygenless atmosphere, so we have nothing to protect ultraviolet C from coming down from the sun and just annihilating anything. Now, ozone's kind of unique. It's if we go back here, you kind of see how big and puffy this ozone layer, how big and puffy this oxygen molecule is, right?
Yeah.
Water is not as big. Ultraviolet C will penetrate because there's only one oxygen molecule there. It will penetrate water. It will just go right through water. Water does nothing for ultraviolet C. It might block a few, but you're not going to get. It's going to irradiate things, even deep oceans, deep seas. It doesn't matter. It will just penetrate everything down to the bottom of the ocean. But what we've also got, basically they say, okay, well, anything on the surface is just fried, right? It's just completely annihilated. You're not going to get anything on the surface to form because of radiation.
Yeah.
You've got ultraviolet C just penetrating everywhere. So what they've done is they take, they say, well, since it couldn't form on the surface of the Earth, it must have formed deep down below in the uh, in the oceans
By
in what's
volcanic
called these
vents.
vents. Yes, in the volcanic vents. They have dark smokers and light smokers and all these things, and they have uh, all this that creates the heat and energy to But what does heat do for ribose?
Breaks apart.
Breaks it apart. We know ribose won't form in heat. Um,
It's also
also,
in water.
also we know that water is a solvent, and we saw from the RNA hydrolysis reaction, um, water does what?
It snips it right in half.
It breaks things apart. Now, this is different from, we think that water is a solvent. If you take salt, take sodium, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
put sodium in salt, and then you evaporate the water away, let the water evaporate, you still
Mm-hmm.
have salt, right?
Yeah.
Salt. If you take salt water, you
Yeah.
evaporate the water, you still have salt. Okay.
Yep.
When you hydrolyze molecules, it literally goes in and breaks apart the molecule. You don't get salt back when you put something in. It will break it apart so that you have nothing but the smallest um, molecules available. If you put a protein chain down there, it's going to just snap apart like nothing, because proteins are hydrolyzed. Um, Now, the deeper you go,
Mm-hmm.
the faster this occurs, and this is called Le Chatelier's principle. Le Chatelier's principle says the more pressure you put on it, it's an equilibrium principle. So the more pressure
Yeah.
you put on it, the faster it's going to break apart. If you want to create something, it has to force its way together. The more water pressure that you have, we have this idea that we have a sub that just imploded um,
Mm-hmm.
not too long ago. The more pressure you put on something, the faster it's going to break apart, because this equilibrium principle. So if you're going deeper into the ocean, it doesn't help you solve the problem. In fact, it makes things worse.
So if
Any
you have a sub implode at 100 meters, it won't break as quickly and fill with water as quickly. But if you have a sub blow up at 5,000 meters, there's an instantaneous filling. It just happens faster.
Yes, that's Le Chatelier's principle. That's what we see in action. So um,
And that happens for chemical
going
reactions. Okay.
and it happens for chemical reactions. Yes. So hydrolysis. What is hydrolysis? Hydrolysis is literally you add water and it breaks apart. So this is a peptide bond,
Mm-hmm.
and when you add water, water will go and it will uh, snap it apart and create two smaller molecules. And the two smaller molecules are the potential energy. So we see that the potential energy is less in two smaller molecules than it is in a big, long molecule.
Yep.
So go ahead and read hydrolysis here.
Proteins are decomposed to amino acids, fats to fatty acids, and glycerol,
Glycerol.
and starches and complex sugars to glucose and other simple sugars. Enzymes such as lipases, amylases, and proteinases catalyze the hydrolysis of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, respectively.
Okay, so enzymes will actually go and help to break things apart. So we actually rely on hydrolysis. Uh, well, again, water is a solvent, so we rely on hydrolysis to help break things apart. And then
Mm-hmm.
water is also a transport system that helps to carry things away or carry molecules to where they're supposed to go. So water is a transport system, and so there's nothing that says, hey, we're going to put these together because water wants to break things apart and it wants to carry things away. It wants to equalize pressure and carry things away.
Yes.
So any molecules that are forming are going to be transported away deep sea in the oceans. They're not going to. There's nothing to want to bond them together. They just want to break apart. So homochirality.
Mentioned this earlier.
Yes, I mentioned homochirality earlier. Homochirality is like a glove. They are two different hands. If you take two different molecules, you can form them in with one thumb on your right hand and one on your right hand and one thumb on your left hand. So they're opposing thumbs, right? So we see these molecules with opposing thumbs. And these are amino acids here. I can't remember exactly which amino acid we see, but the R stands for the side chain that the amino acids connect to. So you can form amino acids in two different ways. But again, you can form ribose in dozens or maybe even hundreds of different ways, depending on, well, I think there's...
It's like its own little Rubik's Cube in the chemical world.
There might be, I think I've heard eight different ways that ribose can form, but still, you have to have the correct one. You have to have the correct ribose. And you cannot synthetically create these things because of the racemic mixture. So go ahead and read the racemic mixture here.
In chemistry, a racemic mixture, or racemate, is one that has equal amounts of left and right-handed enantiomers of a chiral enantiomers of a chiral molecule or salt. Racemic mixtures. It's a little bit of a tongue twister for me. Racemic mixtures, there we go, are rare in nature, but many compounds are produced industrially as racemates.
All right. Racemates. When it says that they are rare in nature, we're talking about life creating them. Life doesn't create a racemic mixture. It creates homochiral molecules. It will create them with either the right hand or the left hand. And all amino acids are right-handed. They are... actually, I'm going to have to go back. Don't quote me on this. They are one-handed one way. I think they're left-handed. Yeah, I think.
Well, either hand that they have chosen which hand they're going to do. So, and that comes from already living things.
So they are L. Amino acids are L. And we get this from like L-aspartame and L. Yeah, so that's what we see. Ribose and the other RNA molecules are right-handed. And so what happens is when you connect things together, if you have a right and left hand, if you have a left-handed one, you can fold it like this and you can keep folding, right? You can keep folding with with one hand. You can keep going. What happens if you connect that, you get tied. You get locked.
You get locked up.
So that's what happens when it folds. If you have a D coming in and connecting with an L, you've got a locked molecule that's going to do nothing. So you have to have homochiral molecules so that you can keep folding in a single way.
And it's important to have that homochirality. Otherwise, these compounds are going to, as you said, become dead.
Yes. And so this is very difficult to do, even through chemistry. If you see that, here's a vitamin E. So what does it say here on the vitamin E? This is kind of like false advertising.
Pure DL alpha. So
pure DL alpha tocopherol.
Okay.
DL. D, right-handed. L, left-handed. It's got both enantiomers in there. And so your body, though, your body knows how to go and take out the good stuff and eliminate the bad stuff. And so what you want is you want one of the chiral. You want D alpha. So the right-handed form of tocopherol, the right-handed form of vitamin E, which is pure D alpha tocopherol, not DL. DL is both hands mixed in there. That's a racemic mixture in application. We see this all over the place. L-aspartame, like I said before, that's one-handed. That's left-handed aspartame. So that's the good stuff. But this is extremely difficult to do for even an industrial. Go ahead and read the synthesis here.
Without a chiral influence, a chemical reaction that makes a chiral product will always yield a racemate. That can make the synthesis of a racemate cheaper and easier than making the pure enantiomer because it does not require special conditions. This fact also leads to the question of how biological homochirality evolved on what is to presume to be a racemic primordial Earth.
There you go. Now, there's a huge problem with homochirality. They claim that they've overcome this a little bit with clay that can kind of make things homochiral, that these molecules will attach themselves to clay and be able to start forming, and you get that. But the Northern Arizona University has come up with a dating method. They actually, amino acids over time will actually switch. If they're all one way, it will over time switch to create both. I don't know how this happens. I don't understand the science behind it, but it basically says that you can date things on how regular,
racemic they are,
and by how racemic they are. But you can date things by how often they switch. It's a timed thing. It's a function that you can track this over time. It's so reliable that they'll switch from one hand to both hands over time.
So we could make a chemical clock with this.
You can make a chemical clock. And so even if you were to create some
homochiral amino acids,
homochiral on clay, they're constantly reverting back. You're constantly getting, you're constantly going back. And the more complicated that the molecule is, the greater chance that it has of switching. So, boom. You cannot get homochirality here if you created a chemical clock that will convert. As we read it here, the amino acid racemization is the interconversion of amino acids from one chiral form, the left, to building blocks to a mixture of L and D. So basically, they're saying that over time, this is something that happens. The extent of racemization, or the extent of how many two-handed molecules there are, is measured and increases as a function of time and temperature. So as you turn up the heat, it's going to go faster. And it can be used as geochronology or paleothermatology, thermometry. However you say that.
Paleothermometry.
Paleothermometry. Thank you. Yes. I was getting tongue-tied there. So what we see here is that this is just how likely, given enough time and enough tries, what is the probability that these things all of a sudden just stop working, the hydrolysis in water stops working, that the oxidation stops working, and that the radiation from the sun stops working? How probable is it that life could form?
Within 2 minutes.
I hear probabilities. It's not even probable. It's not even there's not even a fraction of a probability that it could possibly form. And you won't hear these things taught in any classroom. You won't even hear that. A lot of Christian scientists don't even know these things. I mean, there are some that they might comprehend things, but they have not taken the time to fully understand, like, potential energy and the idea that things just break down over time. I haven't heard this from other scientists. Sometimes you need to come from outside the box, and you need to look at these from a different perspective in order to understand these, because I am not seeing any chance whatsoever that, given time, tries, anything, could ever form life. And any action or any said, well, we don't know how. You've just invoked accident of the gaps. As an atheist, you've just invoked accident of the gaps by saying we don't know how it was formed, because Carl Sagan said it was an accident. And it had to have been an accident, because they violate every law that you can possibly imagine, chemical, thermodynamically, physics. I mean, they violate laws. You cannot be an atheist. You have to believe in a creator of some kind of supernatural creation. And I don't know, whatever kind of creator you want to believe in, you have to believe in some kind of a creator. Now, we can get to what I think the creator is going to be, and that's going to be the problem of evil, which is going to be our next segment. Problem of evil, because how do you resolve, well, what kind of creator then can you pick? You have to believe in a creator, but we don't know. We don't have evidence for what kind of creator that is. Well, we do have evidence. We just don't have concrete evidence. But we can measure things inductively. If basically an inductive reasoning or an inductive form of logic says, if I catch you with a gun in your hand, a smoking gun in your hand, I just heard the shot, I see a body lying on the floor bleeding, you're the only one in the room, you're the only one around, but I didn't see you kill him, right? I didn't see you shoot him. Inductive reasoning says, well, I have probable cause that, you're probably the one that shot the guy, right?
This is, unless there is some supernatural thing that happened to put the gun in your hand at the very moment I turn around to see that this person's dead, I can probably deduce you're the one that did it.
So inductive reasoning is actually valid in determining what kind of God we should believe in. Do we believe in, in all of these gods? Well, we can examine them, and we can choose to look at, well, what kind of God are they? What's the problem with believing in them? You've got to believe in one of them somewhere. You've got to create. We had a supernatural creation. You've got to believe in a supernatural creator, even if you want to believe it's a flying spaghetti monster that created you. I could pretty much throw out the idea that a flying spaghetti monster created us. I can pretty much throw out that that pixies created us. So we can look at inductive reasoning and try to define what kind of creator created us. And so that's for next week. If you liked the video, if you learned something,
I did.
Like it, subscribe, leave a comment below. If you're willing to help pay, or help us out to donate to us
at PayPal, LDS
we can
Christian.
We would more than appreciate that to help us to fund this kind of informative education. And there's a lot to share. So, all right. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. I surely did find a lot of good stuff. This was amazing, and I can't wait for next week.
Any final words or comments?
I just have to shake my head. If you are an atheist and you've been listening to the same things we've just talked about, we've gone over what makes the theory wrong. If this is what you base your life on, you have some hard truths coming your way.
Indeed. All right. Thank you and have a good evening.